I can't actually see that when I'm standing here, so I'm duplicating the screen. So if something goes wrong, just let me know. I'm going to talk today about Dataverse for Teams, but this is a quick introduction to myself. My name is Haynes and I work for Silversands, which is a consultancy company just down in the South Coast. That's my Twitter handle and that's my LinkedIn, both of which are easy to remember. This here is the things that allows you to interval development, which is where you think you've put something funny in and it stays with you for the rest of your life. So it's easy to find me. Just say thank you to our sponsors. This morning, this is all time delay, so. Okay, so I'm going to talk about my experiences with Dataverse for Teams over the last year. So I've been using it heavily over the last year, but I originally come from a developer background, and I was originally a Microsoft 365 developer, so I come from that sort of SharePoint world. I don't come from the Dataverse CRM world, which influences how I look at Dataverse for Teams, what it is and how it works. So when I'm going through the things that I found and worked with, I could well be wrong, and I'm quite willing to accept that. So I don't want actually people to heckle, but if you do think that I'm wrong or there's a different way of doing it, please let me know. Okay, so let's talk about where it fits. So how many people are using it? A fair few. So the larger Dataverse sits at the top of these. So if you think of this like a stepping stone theory or gateway drugs, at the top here you've got Dataverse, which basically does everything. It's got all the nice relational stuff in it. It allows us to use Power Apps that sit on our mobile phones and on our tablets and all of that. And then at the bottom of that, we've got what a lot of people use, which is SharePoint, which allows us to use elements of Power Platform very much in an isolated way. And what was happening up until sort of October last year is that this is quite an expensive entrance point. So lots of people write stuff in SharePoint, guilty of that myself. You can't build a relational database, but people do. And you end up in quite a lot of trouble because this can go wrong. It cannot cope particularly well when we start getting loads and loads of records. So Microsoft saw this and they brought out their Dataverse for Teams, which is the middle area. So it can do a bit of this and it can do a bit of that. Which is exactly the point, but unfortunately it's a weird hybrid. So when you were using it, if you're used to using Canvas apps and designing Canvas apps, it's like that, it's not quite like that. And if you're used to using Dataverse, you've got bits of it, it's not quite like that. So you've got some of the Dataverse stuff in there, but not all of it, which you'd expect. So I found that while I'm working with these different things, having the knowledge of both of this is actually very useful. So if you do come from a Canvas apps world, using SharePoint against your data source, then it can be very useful for moving. And also if you know a little bit about Dataverse, it can be very useful as well, particularly when you get lost or stuck in the middle. It does happen. Now, one of the things you'll see here, we've got our Dataverse at the top, which I was talking about, which can do lots and lots, and it's a very powerful system. And then at the bottom here, we've got our SharePoint, and then in the middle, we have our Dataverse for Teams. Now the thing is, Dataverse for Teams' biggest asset is that it sits in Teams, and its biggest drawback is that it sits in Teams. So what I mean by that is, we are able, within here, to only work within the Teams client. So we cannot put our app down onto the mobile phone, so like a Power App. We can't do certain things that we might be able to do using the full studio of SharePoint, particularly with Dataverse. So it's always bearing in mind before you begin that whoever it is you're writing it for or with is able to use Teams and want it to be installed within it. You'll be surprised at how many people have turned that off. You might not be. They will turn off that Dataverse for Teams because they don't want people creating it and some of the compliance and governance stuff that goes with that. Also on that, it's worth drawing to your attention that if you do start using it, people may turn off Dataverse for Teams, but actually Microsoft push out different products that are using it underneath, like milestones, like inspections. People click on that, they create their Dataverse for Teams, all of a sudden it will appear up in your admin centre, and you think, well, I've turned this off. You haven't, it's still going on underneath. And Microsoft are bringing more and more of those out, so you do need to keep checking. Otherwise you will find you have some of these to look after. So coming from a Canvas apps, SharePoint perspective, the real difference and thing to think about when you're working with it is it's actually all about fluid design. What I mean by that is that the fluid UI is in there. It is built and designed to work in Teams, so it wants to look like Teams. It wants to behave like Teams. The buttons want to be the right colour. It wants to move through in that particular way, which means that Microsoft have used a different set of controls inside there, which when you first use them may be confusing. So you can see there are actually quite a few differences. We've got a different layout, which I'm still getting to terms with. The controls are different, I'll show some of that in a minute. Preview's different in the way it works. Security is definitely very different. It's not as high level as the Dataverse, but it is better than SharePoint in my opinion. And the debugging is very different. In fact, it's almost impossible. So I'm going to go and show that now. So here's the canvas. And what you'll see, if you're used to the other one, is I can't see my controls. And that's because they're all down here on the control button here. Which makes this really difficult if you want to know where you are to then put a new control. So that's what's going on there. I'm just going to fire it up using the different preview. You can see that on the screen.
It seems like I thought I was looking
on here. I can show you the different controls.
Everybody seems to be September.
Oh, that's really helpful. Right. So, over on here, but in the ones you can't see, are the fluid controls. And actually, in here, we've got all our different things. So you can see that they are a similar look and feel in font to the size here. Here are our classic controls. You can turn classic controls on, just go into the background, turn on the classic controls, and they will appear. They have that chunkier feel because they're for using on mobiles, whereas these controls over here sit nicely and they sit within it. But one thing, and I don't quite understand why, that Microsoft have done, is that some of the properties for these are noticeably different to the properties for these. So if you see over here, and we look at the date picker in particular, for the classic, we've got select date, so press that, and select the date. But for fluid ones, we've got value, so I have to use value to get that. And a lot of the ones to do with size, font size, colouring, all of that, they're quite different. This is readily available on the Microsoft site, but it's worth noting that these are different, and you cannot change the theme. So when it comes in, you're always going to get this. So if you want to start changing things and things like that, you've got to think about doing that yourself. Another thing to note, and this drove me mad for ages, that date there is obviously in the English format. If I were to select this, even though we get a lovely date picker that we don't get in Classic here, I don't know if anyone else, but the amount of times I issue something and the first bug that somebody says is, why do I have to press OK when I select my date? Here, you don't have to do that, you just press that and in it goes. But it'll always go in American. Can you change it? No. So this has a format date, that doesn't. It's a known issue, it's on the Microsoft site, they are doing something about it, but they've been doing something about it for the last 8 months. So at the moment, if you want to work and make the date look in English, you have to use the classic control. Okay. But there are many aspects of it that are like Dataverse. We get our relational data. We get views. We get views, and we can use those as data sources within our Canvas apps, which means we can work out what we want very easily. Fundamentally, we get solutions. Not full solutions, as we do in Dataverse, to move things across, but we do get a variation of solutions which allows us to use application lifecycle management. And we get the Dataverse connector. And it's the Dataverse connector that I want to talk about next, because this connector itself is actually really powerful, and what it can do and what it allows you to do with your existing license inside of Teams. So, if I switch over to this sheet again, what the Power Automate allows me to do is to run a flow. Because I'm in a solution, it allows me to call a child flow, something that you can't do in the SharePoint world of working. Because I'm in a solution, I can actually put something into here, it will run my flow, and then it will go and call another one so I can start to compartmentalise. This is very useful if you want to build a flow that does multiple things. If you have a flow inside a process that sends a certain email to different people, you can put that in one flow and then call that child flow. And that all works through here. Now, interestingly, in the week, I decided to test this to make sure it wasn't just working because I had a large Dataverse license. So I built my flow using my other user down here and made sure it works, and it does. So if I go into here and I mention Henry Mass as the person who's written it, what happens is it goes away, and it will always come back and say, sorry, but I'm very busy and important. And that will happen all the time, and it's that person's flow. So it's listening there, and it's calling a child flow, and I'm passing in the message, which means I can use that child flow anywhere to be able to push that information in, which is a really useful tool that you get with Dataverse that you may not see as part of using the Canvas apps. There is another one that's very important as well, and very, very useful. So, in here, I have a flow, and all it's doing is that when I create something in my table, I'm going to go and call and put a row into another table. But what Dataverse allows you to do is let this run as. And you'll see in here, I'm running as a triggering user. So what that means is, I'm able to go and add that row as the user who created the initial row. And if I go and select the other one over here, which hopefully is over here, I can go and do exactly the same thing, but this time I'm going to run it as a process user when it finally decides it wants to wake up. And when I do that, I'm running it as a process user, and it will go and add that record as that process user, which means if I've got to do something that requires a higher level of permissions, I can go and do that using these. And this is something that the Dataverse will give you. So I'll show that. Unfortunately, I have found this to be really slow. But, so if I go into here, so I'm now in as that user, that particular user there. So the other stuff's running as my main account, and this one's all running as Enric Mouse. So I go into here, and in here I've got my thing in here. And so if I put my name or whatever it is I want to put in there, and I press to me to you, that will then put them in as the two different people. If I was to use the other one, it could put it in as a process user. Now, for some reason, I don't know why, it takes a while to do it. And if we were to wait, maybe we'll come back in a minute, and I'll press refresh, it will change it, and it will put the two there. So it does actually work. You might have to take the word for it, because we haven't got much amount of time. Okay, so what we've got to now is it is the same, but there are bits missing, and these are things to be aware of that's missing from the larger Dataverse. There are no rich data types. Well, that is actually a lie. There are rich data types. If you come from the SharePoint world and you look at all the demos, it tells you to go in and open the table and add the things inside of there, and it gives you like a nice table grid. It's not similar to this. But actually, the table does exist underneath. The little table that you get inside your Canvas app will only give you a very small subset of the controls that you can use. If you go into the larger table that you can see, you get many, many more particular data types. So image is in there, for example. So you can go and use image. If you want to have multiple choices is in there, so you can go and use that. But in the little one that exists inside Canvas app, you only get choice. So don't feel that you're limited when you open that. Go and have a look in the table in the background and you'll see that there's a lot more going on in there. One of the things I would say on that though is be careful when you use them because your Canvas app might not be set up to use those particular types of control. So you have to think about how you're going to work with that. But that's the same if you use the larger Dataverse. So for example, if you wanted to add an image, you've still got to think about how you run your Power Automate to get that image and put it into the table. But you can do that. I have a demo that will show you how to do that, which I'm not going to have time for today, but you can do. There are no business rules and there are no forms. Well, that's obvious, we haven't got model-driven apps. So all of these are associated with model-driven apps. When it was first launched, we were told we were going to have model-driven apps. That all seems to have gone very quiet. So maybe we will, maybe we won't, but they're not there at the moment. Data flows we have now got. So they've come in within the last 6 months. They're a very, very small subset of data flows. Data flows is a way of being able to get your data into your given tables. So when we press this, you'll be able to see that the data flows come in and we can start using things like Excel, CSVs, things like that to get the data in. The other one to be aware of is that we don't have any user interface for other tables. What do I mean by that? Well, when you create one of these Dataverses for Teams, you actually get a lot of the tables you get with Dataverse, some of those dynamic tables come through. The user one in particular, but things like string maps, things like note, they're all there underneath, but you can't see them. And so if you're in the larger Dataverse, you want to go and look at the user's table and what it's built of, you can just go in and click it. Inside Dataverse for Teams, it's not there. You have to put your own interface in to go and see that. So it's just something to be aware of. At the present moment in time, if anyone's familiar with XRM Toolbox, which is a utility that does loads and loads of things with Dataverse, it's a brilliant tool. I can't get able to connect to Dataverse for Teams. I just get an error each time. Once I can do that, some of this will go away. If you don't use XRM Toolbox, I would suggest that you do, because it's brilliant. Okay. So now we're back to the last bit, which is where it all fits in with a larger platform. So I've got ish on each of these because application lifestyle is different-ish. So fundamentally, when you create a Dataverse for Teams, you create a new environment. So that means that environment can be compliant, it can be governed, it sits and you can see it inside the administration portal. So if you go to Power Platform Admin Center, you will see that environment. And you'll see all those environments that people have created. But what you can do is if you were to create your team itself and isolate it, you can still have your developer, you can still have your integration, and you can still have your production, but you want them as separate teams. And then you can use solutions to pull them through. Solutions are not as rich as they are inside a Dataverse, so when you're moving them across, you may find that certain elements like flows and things you've got to do separately. Again, compliance and governance is the same-ish. One thing I would suggest that anybody does is they set up their data loss prevention policies so that you have a global one, so whenever that team is created, it goes and puts that in there, and then they can't use certain connectors, people can't use certain connectors you don't want them to, because those environments will go in there. Be careful with that, because the Dataverse connection is in there. Some people may turn off the Dataverse connection because they don't want their people with Dynamics to be unlicensed when they start using it in an environment that hasn't got Dynamics. So they may put Dataverse in there, then of course your environments will stop working. So it's something to be aware of. and it's not easy to navigate away into the environment. So if you are used to using Power Apps and you select at the top, you can go to all your different environments. If you do that Power Apps, you will not see the environments for Dataverse for Teams. If you use Power Automate, you will. And that's because you can build your Power Automate inside of the Power Automate Maker portal for your teams. And that can be very useful if, for example, you're using experimental features to work expressions and so on. So that's worth noting if you want to go. And also, when you're using the Power Automate, you can actually go and see the solutions as well. They sit down below, you can see them, you can see all those elements. Which means if, like myself, you have to go into various people's different environments, you're able to then use that to have more browsers open when you're working with your flows. So the last thing is, we've been through all of that, and the first thing I said was, where does it fit? And also, that's the last question. Now, the reason I've got a person truing the wheel is because if you true a wheel slightly wrong, everything falls apart on the bike. And I'm finding that a bit with this. So Microsoft have launched it, but it's not entirely clear where it fits. So you've got one piece of documentation that talks about it, and then you've got documentation for Dataverse. So recently I've been trying to look at concurrency and what's going on and how the concurrency works. Now I can find that information to do with Dataverse. I can't find it in Dataverse for Teams. I don't know if it's the same. I also have the same problems with the roadmap. So I have the waves for the Power Platform that move, but I couldn't see where the stuff is inside of there. I go to the roadmap to look at Teams, and I can't see anything in there. And that might be just that they're not doing anything, but I don't believe that. So it's difficult at the moment to find it as a point to be able to get information and work with. Also, confusingly, some people call it Dataverse for Teams, some people call it Teams for Dataverse, which means Google is a nightmare as well. So like I said at the beginning, I've been through all sorts of different things there. It's my experience of using it, so if anybody has got any other experiences or they want to ask any questions or they say actually you're wrong, you can format the date if you send it off to Azure API and throw it down and put it in as a label. All of that I'm quite willing to, anyone's willing to say. So that's it, unless anyone has any questions. Yes?
Do you get connection references?
Yes. And you can get environment variables as well. The environment variables you get, as with all of it, you have to go through a mishmash of screens. So you get the build, and then you have to press the thing at the bottom that says all, and then you can get new, and then you can get the environment variables. So it's a little bit tweaky.
Why use this over just an embedded Canvas app on Teams?
Depends what your data source is. So if your data source is Dataverse, then, well, why? Yeah, indeed. But if you're stuck with SharePoint, which a lot of people are because they only have those licenses, this allows you to build a relational database. It can be 2 gigs in size, it can hold 1 million records. It's got all of that goes with it. Obviously it's in the cloud, it's looked after by Microsoft, so there are very good reasons to use it over and above SharePoint. And particularly when Microsoft moved to the SQL Server connector to be premium, everyone was suddenly shut off for things that they were doing previously. And when they made the HTTP connector at the same time premium, it suddenly shut a big door, which is what this is filling as your big step up to Dataverse. It's very easy as well to port from Teams to Dataverse. Yeah.
Any updates on the governance?
Yes. So I did mention compliance and governance. The thing I forgot to mention is that there is something called the Centre of Excellence. And the Centre of Excellence is something that you can put in over and above, and it shows you everything that's going on in your environment. So it shows you things like all the teams that have been created. It produces an excellent Power BI report, which will tell you all your environments, where they fit and how they work. But it does require those people to use it for certain elements of it to have the premium license, because there is an app in there that allows people to justify their app. In order to do that, sits inside Dataverse, need a premium license. However, they have now brought out a version of COE that works inside of Teams. It's not as rich, but you can install it into Teams, you can work with it in that way, you can still do the auditing, it has the app-to-us people for their areas. And actually, as each release of the Centre of Excellence comes out, the new Teams stuff is going in, there are now different things we're working on the team, so it's coming but slowly. Microsoft seems to be putting a lot of emphasis on compliance and governance, so we'll see what they say in a couple of weeks' time, I think.
Are you finding that this is being used by system developers or professional developers or both?
I come from the professional, what people would call professional developer, although I'm not sure I ever was, and so I find it difficult to know to answer that question because I come from that world. But I think Microsoft will show you the easy way of developing things, which is here's the data, here's a view, I can type this in here and type that in there, and I've got all my things, but I don't have all the complicated types, for example. So I think it's easy to get yourself in a mess if you don't know what you're doing. It's easy to get yourself in a mess if you do. And so, at the moment, yes, they can, but I would think about training people, that Centre of Excellence, that's saying to people, helping people to build stuff, helping them through. I wouldn't just let it loose, because you will end up in a mess. Thank you.
Thank you.